What's up, you guys? Void here coming back at y'all with another underrated Commander cards list, where I go over 10 cards that may be well known, but their value is definitely underrated. Now, to change things up a bit from what I usually do when I just go and pick at random, look at random sets from the past, I'm going to be looking for the most part at sets that for the last few years, so you're going to see a lot of newer cards. I believe every single card is still in standard except for like a few of them, so that should give you an idea of how new the card selection is going to be. So to start things off, we're going to look at Geier Sanitarium. I honestly just think that card draw on a land is always going to be underrated because most people just look for ramp in their lands, but I also think the other reason why it's underrated because people don't like giving card draw to other people, which I can understand. You don't want to give them advantage as well, but it is a draw and discard, so if they have no cards in hand, it's pretty much useless to them. And there are many decks where forcing your opponents to draw cards is actually good, such as in Nekasar, and as well in Group Hug, where giving opponents card draw is more or less just going to incentivize them to not attack you. I think it's still a pretty good card. Doesn't see the play it deserves. I think it's honestly a staple in a ton of decks in the format. And then the next card we have is actually all 10 of the Scrylands. None of them in particular stand above the others. They're just all pretty much the same. They're good mana fixing. They're dual lands. They come into play tapped. All from the Theros block, which was just a very underrated block. I feel like a lot of people just hated it, but it wasn't as bad as people remember. And I think in time, once people see the value of these lands, that set's also going to be viewed in a more fond light. Because all you do is you get to scry 1, which is such a weird thing. Some people don't like that on their lands. We're so used to them just entering the battlefield tapped and doing nothing, but scrying 1, it's not better than having a shock land come into play untapped, of course, but you get basically turn 1 a way to ensure that your next draw is what you want it to be, or at least not what you want it to be. So when you think about decks that don't play a lot of lands, these are actually pretty good. If you're going to play maybe 35, maybe 34 lands as opposed to the usual 37, playing consistency on a land is actually very good. And all I know is that I'm usually the first one to play these scry lands in my play group. Usually everyone else is just sort of, oh, I'm going to get a fetch land out, get my shock land. So I don't know. I just love them. I think they're brilliant, incredibly underrated, extremely cheap. You can still pick them up. Most of them are under $3. Don't really see play in Modern. Saw some play back in Standard, if that gives you an idea of their playability, but I still think they're good for Commander. And then we have all of the expertises. So, yep, Void Mage is throwing you guys a little curveball here. We're just going to categorize all cards as the same here. The expertises, I think they're all pretty good. Rishkar is probably the best one, because it does give you card draw and then allows you to then play a card free. So I think that's pretty good, but they're all going to have some sort of value in Commander when it comes to decks that want to get extra spells cast. If you want to get those storm counts up, it's never a bad thing to play an expertise. So I've seen Baral's expertise, Yeheni's expertise, even Kari Zev's expertise in some storm builds in Commander if they want to build around either Kess or Yidris. I've seen those storm builds work out pretty well, and they do sometimes play these expertise cards. Now, Strom's expertise might be the weakest just because I don't think it does enough. Just a few tokens. It is pretty good, but I don't know if it offers enough for Commander. The strongest I would have to say is probably Rishkar's and Baral's expertise, just because Baral's gives you that bounce removal, or gives you a way to bounce your own stuff to your hand, so it's useful in that aspect. And of course, Rishkar does give you the card draw. So all of them I think are going to be pretty good, because getting free cast triggers, or just getting free cards to cast in general, even if it is dependent on the CMC, is still brilliant. So wonderful cards. It's going to take some time for these cards to see some more play, but not even in just Commander. I think in other formats, maybe even Modern, we might see these cards return. So yeah, invest in them while you can. I think they're still extremely cheap. And then next we have Manic Scribe from Shadows over Innistrad. Just a 0/3 human wizard. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So right there, gonna just mill out your opponents the top 3. Not super special, but if you do have Delirium, which it's not hard at all in Commander to get Delirium if you are just able to cast instants and sorceries, sack, fetch lands, mill yourself out a little bit, anything like that. In a mill deck in Commander, it shouldn't be too hard to get Delirium. But if you do, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So not going to put in a ton of work, but over the course of the game, it could add up and become something quite significant. Mill decks are sort of the quickest to get hated on, it seems, in a lot of playgroups, and it is for a good reason. A lot of people don't like their resources hitting the graveyard before they even get the chance to consider playing them in their hand. But this card, I don't think, takes it too far. It's just 3 cards at the beginning of their upkeep if you have Delirium, so conditions have to be met, and even once they are met, it is still just 3 cards, and as long as Commander games can last, it might seem like a lot, but a few turns can pass, it might be an hour's time. So 9 cards all out of Manic Scribe for each opponent. I don't think it's bad. Definitely I can understand why it might be underrated, but for mill decks in general, cards like these are just invaluable to the strategy because they don't draw a ton of hate. They just do a little bit and they kind of chip away at your opponents. And a lot of those cards are some of the best in the format if you think about it. Your typical cards like Blood Artists, these cards that can chip away at your opponents and not draw too much hate. By themselves, they're not overwhelming, but they put in a lot of work over the course of the game. So I think it's definitely good. I can understand why it's underrated, but if you're playing Mill and you haven't played this card yet, give it a shot. Then we have Metallurgie Summonings. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create an XX colorless construct artifact creature token where X is that spell's converted mana cost. And then you can pay 5 mana and exile it to return all instant and sorcery cards from your graveyard to your hand. You can only activate this ability if you control 6 or more artifacts. So really a weird card to say the least. And just to clarify, a card doesn't have to be unknown to the community in order to be underrated in my eyes. It just has to be undervalued when it comes to seeing playing Commander. And I feel like the reason why this card is a little bit undervalued is because it's kind of awkward. I mean, you could put it in a Spells Matter deck, and that would work out pretty well. Something like Talrand Sky Summoner, a deck that already cares about instant and sorceries, that you get even more out of those cast triggers, so you get the Drakes in addition to the artifact creatures. I think that's pretty good. You could also try to storm off with it if you're playing any sort of deck, like say Cast Dissonant Mage. It's not a fantastic card, but you do have a way to get those instant and sorceries back. I wouldn't play it over something like Yawgmoth's Will for that reason, but it's definitely worth considering. The other awkward thing is that obviously if you have something that can just pop out all those artifact tokens, you would want to throw it into an artifact deck. It doesn't really fit that well into artifact decks because you need instant and sorceries to take advantage of it, and you can't always depend on getting them in those decks. So obviously this is going to fit into Spells Matter decks. I just don't really feel like people are all aboard the bandwagon yet. And then next we have Herald of Anguish. Now, does see some standard play, but we don't really care about standard, we care about Commander. So I'm going to tell you right off the bat, the improvise isn't what I see being underrated about it. Cost reduction is good, but it doesn't always impress me. It is a typical 5/5 flying demon, so that's usual. But at the beginning of your end step, each opponent discards a card. This is where I really see this card being underrated in Commander. Pair this up with something like Nath of the Gilt Leaf, and you have a way to get even more elf tokens out there. Forcing your opponents to discard cards at random in addition to that is insane. And you also have the activated ability where you can sacrifice an artifact and give a creature -2/-2 until end of turn, which is pretty weak. So overall, understandably underrated, but with a discard trigger, with a trigger that forces your opponents to discard a card at your end step. Pair this up with other effects that force your opponents to discard, maybe some wheel effects, and have stuff like Liliana's Caress, Waste Not on the field, Bloodchief Ascension, those cards that just do so well whenever you can get the cards from their hand into their graveyard. I would see it definitely as a support card in those decks, but overall, just a good creature with a good end step trigger that I definitely think should see some more play. It's a good card. Then we have Vance's Blasting Station that flips into Spitfire Bastion. Now, the obvious comparison is going to be something like Outpost Siege. I would say Outpost Siege does give you the option, however, it is very restricted to one of those options that you could either just benefit from creatures leaving the battlefield, or you could get a good upkeep consistency trigger. They both pretty much serve the same exact purpose. Vance's Blasting Station is going to let you cast another spell, you exile the top card of your library, and you get to play that card. Now, I would say the main value that you get out of Vance's Blasting Cannons is the same exact value you could get out of an Outpost Siege, because most people in Red and Commander are looking for that consistency. We don't have a Sylvan Library in Red, we don't have a Phyrexian Arena in Red, so we need a way to get some more consistency, some more advantage, and even if it is casting a card off the top of our deck, it's not nearly as good as the cards I just mentioned, but it's what you can get in Red, and playing both of these in Commander is still going to be good. Now, we can just ignore the Spitfire Bastion because the activated ability to deal 3 damage just isn't that great. It's something, but I wouldn't depend on that as my removal as much as I would depend on Vance's blasting cannons to give me some sort of consistency during my upkeep. So, very underrated red enchantment, still dirt cheap, but then again, Outpost Siege is also dirt cheap, so good cards. Red is usually going to have some underrated value in Commander. And then we have Shaper's Sanctuary. I think this might be the newest card on the list from Ixalan. Whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell or an ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. So it's very similar to Leovold in that aspect, where if your opponents want to do something to your creatures, you then get to draw a card. It's incredibly cheap, which is another thing to consider. It's just 1 green mana. It's not going to take priority over your Sylvan Libraries, your guaranteed card draw. This doesn't put in as much work as that, I would say, because your opponents don't have to target your creatures, so you're not guaranteed that card draw. They could just as easily board wipe and deny you that. But I still think for the mana cost, if you are playing mono green, what you lack is usually going to be card draw. You have some good ones, some good one-time use green spells that can draw you cards equal to the number of creatures you control, and you have Sylvan Library, but just more consistency adding to that deck already, whether you're playing mono green elves or just a mono green creature deck. In Commander, getting more consistency in card draw, not only that, but also deterring your opponents from targeting your stuff, is usually pretty good. Also another card that is just dirt cheap in Ixalan that should definitely see some more play in Commander. And then we have Champion of Rhonas. You may exert him, and when you do, you get to put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. Just a 3/3 for 4, no other keywords or anything like that, so I can understand why it's a little bit underrated, but exerting and then just cheating something into play, you don't have to put any more mana into him. You could just attack the following turn, free up all your mana, you get the best creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. That is just insane. And this card, I don't know why it hasn't seen more play in Commander. It's every single creature-based green deck in the format, something like Animar, your typical one, should definitely be playing this card. You're cheating stuff into play. I know it's not going to trigger Animar. You're not going to get an extra +1/+1 counter because that only happens on cast, but still, getting the best stuff from your hand is always good. You cheat into play. It's already a busted mechanic when you can cheat something into play with other cards, such as Omniscience. Why is this any worse? I mean, it's a 4-mana green creature, super easy to get out there. Throw Lightning Greaves on it, exert it. Yeah, you don't get to untap it. You have to wait a turn to do that, but still, cheating a creature into play is definitely worth exerting. Such a great card. And the last card that I have for you guys, the last underrated card, I would have to say is Second Harvest from Shadows over Innistrad. Not really viewed in the same light as a Parallel Lives or a Doubling Season or Anointed Procession, effects that stay on the field and trigger whenever you would create a token, so obviously it's going to see less play than those cards, but what you get is a 4-mana instant that basically doubles the number of tokens you have. And this is also going to consider non-creature tokens as well. So if you have artifact tokens, anything like that that aren't technically creatures, like treasure tokens, this would work with that, give you more of those tokens. So it's not just your creatures, which is a good thing. But what you get is sort of a one-time use, not necessarily a doubling season on an ETB like Deep Glow Skate is, but if you're playing something like Risk the Redeemed, any token deck that wants to go wide quick, if you're playing something like Prosh, Skyraider of Care, that deck definitely wants to go wide with tokens. Second Harvest is just a perfect card for those decks. I would still say it would be a good card even if it was just sorcery speed, but instant speed means that you can do this at your opponent's end step and then have your turn with all these tokens you just created at your disposal. So if you are playing a Prosh, you could sacrifice them, get more power on your side, combo off, whatever you want to do. If you're playing Risk the Redeemed, well, you know how crazy that deck can get once you get more tokens out there. It's just going to be copying more tokens, getting more tokens, and just getting out of control. Maybe something like Tristani, also get some more tokens, gain a ton of life. But the card is also, yet again, super cheap. It's probably going to stay that way. It's definitely underrated compared to your typical Parallel Lives effect that's just going to sit on the field. Whenever I make a token deck in green, I usually go and look at a card like this because it's super cheap. It's not going to demand the price of those other cards, and it's going to put in a lot of the same value. So that's going to do it for this list. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment in the comment section below. Like this video, share it with your friends. And again, I mean, a card on this list doesn't have to be completely unknown in order to be underrated. I know some people might have that misconception about this list or about my videos in general. whenever I make an underrated Commander cards video, it's typically going to be cards that just don't see enough play. It's not that they don't see any play at all, it's just that the play they see just isn't there. It's usually in some very fringe decks that maybe not a lot of people know about. So more exposure for these cards means that more people get to play with them. And I'm definitely proud if I can do that. But anyway, you guys have a wonderful day. Void here signing off.